his postdoctoral tenure. He was then invited to Paris, France, and Bielefeld, Germany, as a visiting scientist for 1 year each. While he was at Paris, he secured his present job at IIT Bombay and joined it after completing his work in Germany. At IIT, he has been participating in various activities involving research, teaching, and mathematics outreach. He has visited many institutes in India and abroad for research collaboration. Besides doing mathematics, he likes to interact with the young minds and encourages them to do mathematics. With all respect, I invite Professor Sripadam Gage for the talk. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Am I audible? Tibin sir? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay,
sir.
great. It's a pleasure to thank Matthew sir, the coordinator Tibin sir, Thomas sir, and many other people who are behind the curtain doing their job so that this thing goes well. Best wishes for the Teachers' Day to you all. I think we cannot underestimate the influence that teachers have had in our life, meaning we are nothing without our teachers. This day is the birth anniversary for one of our past presidents, Dr. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan. And recently, unfortunately, we have also lost one of our recent past presidents. So whatever it is worth, I dedicate this talk to memory of Dr. Pranab Mukherjee. And let me start now. So I will start sharing my screen. Okay. So I hope you can all see the slides. Do you see the slides, or is there a lag?
Yes,
Great.
sir. Yes.
So Lie
So,
groups, this is a very difficult object actually, and I should congratulate Matthew sir for thinking about having a talk on Lie groups. Lie groups are something which is not an easy object, and in masters it is very unlikely that we come across Lie groups. So having an exposition on Lie groups is a very good thing. Lie groups has a very rich history, and the theory of Lie groups is very beautiful. It's a very deep study. So it is unfortunate that we will have to miss out on some aspects of Lie groups while we are giving this short talk. It's a 1 hour or maybe 1 hour plus epsilon minutes talk, and I will not be able to do justice to everything that is nice in Lie groups. In fact, there can be courses on 3, 4 different themes in Lie groups. So Lie groups is such a rich history, but let me start and try to give a quick introduction. So if there is any problem, please let me know now. I will not be able to see the comments or any other.
Excuse me, sir. Your screen is not visible, sir.
Screen is not visible. Okay, so maybe I should stop sharing the screen and
One
I
second,
will
sir.
start sharing it again. So what happens is, I think if someone else starts presenting, then maybe this presentation gets lost. This is what has been happening a few times. We are all learning due to this pandemic. We have to deal with the situation. So do you now see it?
Yeah, it's fine, sir.
Yes, sir.
Great. So this is a very beautiful picture, and this is related to what is called the Lie group of the type E8. So I think somebody else started presenting once again, and I'm no longer presenting. Ramchandra, can you stop sharing? Yeah, thank you. Do you now see my screen, or should I start?
You have to start it again, sir.
Okay. All right. So this is if you search for Lie groups, I think one of the very first Google search results that you get will be the Wikipedia page. And if you go to the Wikipedia page, then this beautiful picture is the picture that we see. So this is related to what is called the Lie group of the type E8. But this is really going ahead. So let's start from some very basic thing. So what is a Lie group? Lie group, as anyone would guess, it's a group, first of all. So it's a very special type of group. And we have been studying group theory since our BSc days. So we know that groups are the objects that encode symmetry. So we know some of the symmetric objects, the very basic regular n-gons. For instance, we have the regular triangle, the equilateral triangle. Then we have the square. Then we have the regular pentagon, hexagon, and so on. And in three-dimensional, we have the regular solids, the dodecahedron, icosahedron, cube, tetrahedron, and octahedron. These are classified. And even in higher dimension, there are the regular solids of that particular dimension. And there are some nice finite groups associated with these. So these groups are the ones that encode the whole symmetry. And then one can actually see that, you may have a set with some structure, and then groups will preserve that structure. So groups are objects which will preserve that structure. So groups are some kind of maps from the given set to itself, which encode symmetry in a very broad sense. And then Lie groups are the ones which encode a very specific type of symmetry, which we may call, for the purpose of understanding, the smooth type of symmetry. So it's always good to try and understand everything through examples. So let me give some very basic examples. Here is a beautiful picture of a butterfly, and we see that it has the symmetry through the axis, which we have drawn here through the dashes. And it's a twofold symmetry. There is what is called reflection. You can reflect the butterfly along this dotted line, and you will get the same picture back. If you were allowed to go to 3 dimension, then maybe you can also rotate through this dotted line along the 180 degrees, and you will get your butterfly back. So these are the things that we can do with symmetry. There can be objects with slightly complicated symmetry. So here we have that there is a 6-fold symmetry. So you have reflections, of course, and then you have the rotations. So you can rotate by 60 degrees. This is, let's say, the longer arm. This long arm can go to this second long arm by the rotation of 60 degrees. This will go to the third, and so on. So this is being rotated. You can reflect it along either a long arm or a short arm. So there are many more reflections here that are possible. So this is a snowflake's abstract picture of a snowflake. If you look at a genuine natural snowflake, then maybe there will be some distortion while you take the photo or so, and therefore it will not be exactly symmetric. But this is how a snowflake would typically look like, and therefore if we draw the corresponding symmetric picture, then this is how it looks. So here we see that there is many more symmetry. There are many more symmetries compared to this very simple symmetric picture of butterfly that we have. This is further complicated because here we can of course take any, so you may fix a center for the inner circle that is also the center for the outer circle, and now any line which passes through the center will give you an axis through which you can reflect this ring. Moreover, keeping the center fixed, you can rotate this ring through any angle. So this is what we meant by saying that we are looking at smooth type of symmetry. So first of all, smooth type would mean intuitively that we are looking at an infinite set of symmetries where you can go from one symmetry to another in a continuous or in a smooth way. You have done a course on differential geometry. looked at some of the past lectures that you have had, and there was a lecture on differential geometry. So you know intuitively what it means to go from one symmetry to another in a smooth way. We are going to look at these kind of pictures when we look at Lie groups. So this is for the basic introduction. So what is a Lie group? Once again, we noticed that it is a special type of Lie group, and that Lie groups encode a specific type of symmetry called the smooth type. So now let me give the definition to you, the precise definition. So a Lie group is, first of all, it's a manifold. So there is a manifold structure on the Lie group. So let me just quickly recall to you what a manifold is. Manifold is a topological space with the property that for every point there is an open subset inside your space G, which is isomorphic to open subset in some Rn. So what I did not say here is that it's a real manifold that we are going to look at. We are not going to worry about the complex manifolds yet, but this is a standing assumption, and therefore I will not mention it now and later in later lecture parts of the lecture also. So this is what is called a real manifold, that you have some kind of local homeomorphism with spaces in Rn, and moreover, whenever you have intersection of two open sets, then there should be some compatibility for the homeomorphisms. So we are actually going to ask for more than the compatibility of homeomorphisms. We are asking for the manifold structure to be smooth, which means that we are looking for the corresponding compositions as you go from one open set in Rn to the open set containing your point, which is perhaps intersected with another open set containing your point, and then you go to another open set in Rn, which gives you some map from open set in Rn to another open set in Rn. We want that map to be a diffeomorphism, a smooth map whose inverse is also smooth. So this is what we mean by saying that G is a smooth manifold. And moreover, this is something which is actually taken as a natural assumption, and many people assume it always, but I want to mention it, that this is assumed to be a finite dimensional manifold always. We are not going to look at the infinite dimensional ones. So our Lie group, first of all, has this smooth manifold structure. That is what corresponds to Lie. And now group. So this should also be a group. So it's a finite dimensional manifold, which is also a group. And there should be some tie-up of these two structures. So you have a manifold structure on one hand, and you have the group structure on the other hand. And this is something that I like to tell while teaching almost every course, that whenever we put two different structures on a set in mathematics, we tie these two structures by some kind of properties. So basic example is the example of a ring. On a ring, we have addition and we have multiplication. And then we say that there is a rule which tells you how the multiplication behaves with respect to addition, the distributivity, which says that A plus B into C has to be equal to A into C plus B into C. Or it should be and A into B plus C is A into B plus A into C. So there are always some structures which are put on a set, and then we combine these different structures by means of some properties. So here the properties are that the two natural maps, when you have a group structure, the product in the group and the inverse in the group, these maps should be smooth maps. This is the condition that we put on the manifold G. So it's a manifold which is smooth finite dimensional, which is also a group, such that the product and the inverse are smooth maps. some people may combine these two and say that G comma H going to G H inverse is a smooth map, and you may try to figure out whether these two things are equivalent. But it is better to have it in two parts. So it's a manifold, which is also a group with the property that G comma H going to GH and G going to G inverse are smooth maps. Now, in mathematics, whenever we understand a new concept, often the definitions seem very daunting. So some people may think that, wow, if it's a smooth manifold, so I should perhaps understand all the theory of smooth manifolds to understand Lie groups, or perhaps I should understand all the theory of groups to understand Lie groups. Thankfully, this is not quite true. You may assume some of the things as black boxes. You may, of course, while dealing with Lie groups, sometimes we may have to use results coming from manifold theory, and sometimes you may have to use results coming from group theory. If you have the preparedness to take them as black boxes, we will say that, all right, I will accept these on the faith of the instructor or on the face of the webinar, somebody from IIT Bombay. So let's accept these and go ahead with the theory. And then that also works quite a lot of times. So mathematics is all about logic. You assume a few things and then try to deduce things from that. So maybe perhaps we should begin with examples, but actually before we go to examples, let me tell you why we study Lie groups. So this is something which I am asked every time I give a webinar on different topics. What are the applications of the topics? So if I gave a webinar on continued fractions recently, and I was asked what is the application of continued fraction. And so I thought Lie groups are of course very useful, and meaning in the end it will not serve the purpose to tell a few applications. So maybe I should just list them here and get done with that right at the beginning. So Lie groups are very useful almost every branch of mathematics. And the very first thing is that Lie groups will help us in understanding smooth objects. So for instance, the ring that we saw, that ring, and if you had the torus, then these two can be understood because the torus will have some more automorphisms. The Lie group, the symmetry is associated to torus or a donut type of object, something which looks like a cycle tube, that has more symmetries. So the symmetries help us in distinguishing objects which are smooth in nature. That's the very first and motivating application of Lie groups. Moreover, there are numerous applications of Lie groups in differential equations, number theory, algebraic topology, to mention a few areas. There are in fact books called Applications of Lie groups in Differential Equations. There are conferences which people organize routinely, and they are devoted to applications of Lie groups in differential equations. In fact, Lie groups originated as something which would apply in differential equations. So the origins of Lie groups lie in differential equations. There are surprisingly nice connections with number theory and Lie groups. There is something which is called Langlands program. So this is a keyword, perhaps I should have written it down here to help you all. So this is called Langlands, Langlands, Langlands program. So this is a program which tries to classify some objects in number theory by classifying the associated objects in Lie theory. So that's the number theory applications. Then there are applications in algebraic topology. So this is something similar to what we had in the beginning about distinguishing smooth objects. So there are many algebraic topological questions which can be understood by the corresponding question in Lie groups. So for instance, there are these questions about n spheres, whether there is what is called a continuous non-vanishing vector field on a given n sphere. And the answer to that is that only when the corresponding spheres have a Lie group structure. So of course, S1 is our usual sphere in R2 that has a Lie group structure, and then S3 has a Lie group structure. So this is very famous theorem which is called that you cannot, it's called hairy ball theorem. This is the theorem in topology that you cannot comb a ball. Assume that you have a ball and there are hair coming out of the ball, and if you were trying to comb them, then the combing process will give you a non-vanishing vector field at every point, and then there is no way to do it continuously. So this is understood by the corresponding theorem that S2 has no Lie group structure. So these are some basic applications of Lie groups in these areas. There are then applications of Lie groups in physics as well. And the two keywords to see here are gauge theory and supersymmetry. So if you search for these, so Lie groups again are the objects which encode symmetry in some of these physical systems, and that's why you have supersymmetry coming there. Gauge theory is also a similar study, and Lie groups, and in particular their representations, have been very useful in physics also. The earlier picture that I showed to you, the beautiful picture corresponding to E8, so that group E8 seems to be very useful in what is called string theory. So string theory says that we have we should not consider our world to be just three-dimensional world, but a much more dimensional world, and there these groups E8 especially come into picture. So I will not say anything more about this right now. Maybe it's now time to go to examples. So remember once again that a Lie group is a manifold which is also a group, and the multiplication and inversion, these are smooth maps. So these are some of the basic examples. G, which is, we take the G to be Rn under addition. So this is just the group of vectors, n-dimensional vectors in Rn with the n-dimensional vectors with real coefficients. These form a Lie group with the most natural group operation, which is the addition. Then there is this very standard example, G equal to GLN. This is a Lie group under matrix multiplication. So of course, whenever we say that something is a Lie group, we should ideally check that it's a manifold, check that it's a group. Maybe checking that it's a group is not a difficult thing, but checking that it's a manifold will require some familiarity with these objects. In fact, you may say that Rn is of course a manifold in the very natural way, just Rn homeomorphic to Rn, and then GLNR can be seen as something sitting in MNR, the n by n matrices. So it's a subset of Rn square. And moreover, we can look at the determinant map, which goes from MNR, the n by n matrices, to R. It's a map which takes a matrix in MNR and sends the matrix to its determinant. Now this determinant is a map which is actually a polynomial in the entries of the matrix. And there is no dividing by anything. It's a polynomial. It's not a rational function. It's a polynomial. Therefore, it is a continuous map. And once you have a continuous map, inverse image of open set is open, right? So you take the determinant map and take the inverse image of all non-zero real numbers. That will give you GLNR. So we have the determinant map from all n by n matrices to the real line, and you take the inverse image of what is called R star or R cross. The inverse image of this open set is going to give you GLNR. GLNR is precisely the set of n by n matrices which are invertible, which is the same thing to say that it's the set of n by n matrices whose determinant is non-zero. So it's an inverse image of all non-zero real numbers under the determinant map, and therefore it's an open subset in Rn square. We understood from the earlier example that Rn is a manifold. Replace n by n square, you get Rn square to be a manifold. And then every open subset of a manifold has a natural manifold structure. So getting a manifold structure on GLNR is not that difficult. Showing the product is also not difficult, that GLNR is a group under multiplication. What is slightly tricky is to show that the product and the inversion are smooth maps. But that is something that I will not do right now. There is another example, G equal to SONR. So, all these symbols have some meaning. I should perhaps have said that when you look at GLNR, the G and L stands for general linear group. So this is the general, G for general, L for linear group. R stands for the coordinates that you are taking from. So if it is GLNC, then you are going to take n by n matrices with complex numbers as the entries. Here we are looking to get matrices with real entries. And this subscript n will tell you what is the size of your matrix. So similarly, SONR, SO encodes something. So O stands for orthogonal matrices. These are the matrices which satisfy A into A transpose equal to identity. So these are invertible matrices to begin with. Moreover, the inverse of the matrix A has to be the transpose of the same matrix. This is what we demand. These are called orthogonal matrices and they form a group. Whenever you have A and B orthogonal, then the product AB is also orthogonal. And then one checks that if you take A equal to A transpose inverse, then the determinant of any such matrix has to be 1 or minus 1. If you further impose the property that you are going to look at only those whose determinant is 1, then that gives you the symbol S. So S stands for special, which always corresponds to determinant being 1. So instead of GLNR, if we were to look at SLNR, that would give us special linear matrices which are of size n with real entries, and SONR in analogy will give us special orthogonal matrices with real entries of size n. Okay, this is another group. This is because this is a closed subgroup of GLNR. So we saw that GLNR is an open subset of something, therefore it's a manifold in a natural way. Further, every closed subset of a manifold is also a manifold. And therefore, SONR is again a manifold. It may not be manifold of the same dimension. When you look at some manifold of dimension, some dimension, and you take an open subset in it, that open subset is a manifold of the same dimension. But when you look at a closed subset, the manifold dimension may go down. So that's a small thing that we have to worry about. But perhaps let's not worry about that. What we need to only observe is that this is a subgroup. It's a closed subgroup. And in fact, what we have here is that a closed subgroup of a Lie group is a Lie group. So a closed subgroup of a Lie group is always a Lie group. And I will give you one more slightly non-trivial example, which is the group of isometries of Rn. So Rn comes equipped with the usual distance, and the group of isometries are precisely the bijections from Rn to Rn which preserve the distances. So there are two natural groups already here which are going to preserve distances. The group G equal to SONR, this preserves distances. In fact, if you have two vectors in Rn, say V and W, and you take the distance between them, then you apply some special orthogonal matrix or even an orthogonal matrix A, to V and W, you are going to get two more vectors, AV, AW. Then the distance between AV, AW and the distance between V and W is the same. So our group SONR, or in fact the group ONR, the group of n by n orthogonal matrices, is a subgroup of the group of isometries. And then there is one more such example. The group Rn under addition, if you add by a fixed vector to all the vectors, the distance is not going to change. If you take two vectors in R2 and add the vector 1, 1 to these two vectors, the distance of the additions will remain the distance of the earlier vectors. So these two, the orthogonal group, and this is called the translation group. These are subgroups of the group of isometries, and one can in fact prove, this is one very nice, delightful exercise to show that every isometry of Rn is obtained as V going to AV plus W, where A is an orthogonal matrix and W is a vector in Rn. So the group of isometries is obtained as some kind of product of the orthogonal groups and the group Rn itself. These are some of the standard examples. The basic example that you should keep in mind is also this G equal to GLN-R, the general linear groups. Now, once you have some examples, one should also try to look at a non-example. But there is a slight difficulty here because we are, when we say that it should be a manifold, which is a Lie group has to be a manifold with some properties, that means there is an underlying topology that is coming. So we have to specify the topology on the given group. Only then we can say whether it's a Lie group or not. So the example of rational numbers should come with a specified topology. And the topology that we give on the rational numbers is the Euclidean topology, the subspace topology that we get from the natural topology on the real line. With that topology, this is not a Lie group because it doesn't become a manifold. You don't have, in fact, for every rational number, if you take some open interval around it, this open interval is not going to be connected. You are looking at it only containing rational numbers. We are not looking at the whole real interval, and therefore there is no chance that this open neighborhood around the given point in Q will be isomorphic to some open subset of Rn, because every open subset of Rn, naturally we will try to take it to be connected. If you don't take it to be connected, at least we will take it to be finite or something, or we may even say that every basic open set is homeomorphic to a basic open set, and that doesn't hold for the Euclidean topology on the group of rational numbers Q. So this is not a Lie group. You may ask whether Z is a Lie group, and Z does turn out to be a Lie group with the discrete topology. So there are some surprising examples of Lie groups, but of course this is an example of a Lie group. This is an example of a topological group which is not a Lie group. And the message that we take from here is that topology of the Lie groups, that is a very important thing here. So we see that in the definition we use the manifold structure and the group structure. The topology was somewhere hidden, and the topology is something which is very interesting. So what we are going to do as a warm-up study to understand the various Lie groups is to understand their topology. That's something that we should try to understand. So let's look at the examples that we have seen earlier. We look at the examples of Rn. Rn is connected. In fact, it is path connected, that we all know. That you take any point in Rn and any other point, you can join them by a straight line. So you have a homeomorphism from the closed interval 0, 1. There is some disturbance. Maybe everybody should switch the mic off. That would reduce the disturbance to everybody, or maybe the host can switch mic off for everyone. Yeah, great. Thank you. So Rn is an example of a group which is connected because, as I said, it is path connected. So given any two vectors in Rn, you can simply join them by a straight line segment, which is homeomorphic to the closed and bounded interval 0, 1. Therefore, it's a path. So any 2 points can be joined by a path. The space therefore is path connected, and every path connected space is connected. This is non-compact because it's not bounded, for instance. So Rn is something whose topology we understand very nicely. Next group was the group G of all invertible n by n matrices. This is neither connected nor compact. So we had the earlier example which was connected but not compact. Then we come to something which is not connected, neither connected nor compact. Why is it not connected? This is because we saw the determinant map already. The determinant map was taking GLNR to non-zero real numbers, and non-zero real numbers is not a connected set. This determinant map is a continuous map. A continuous map will take a connected set to connected set. So if GLNR was connected, then its image, which is R star, that should also be connected, but that is not true. Therefore, what we get here is that this group GLNR is not connected. Why is it not compact? It is not compact because it has closed subgroups which are isomorphic to R. And a closed subset of a compact space has to be compact, whereas we have seen here that Rn is non-compact. It is not a compact set, it's not bounded. So GLNR, which has closed subgroups isomorphic to R, cannot be compact. But what is a closed subgroup in GLNR which is isomorphic to R? So these can be given very specifically. You take the following type of matrices. You take ones on the diagonal. Below the diagonal, you take all the entries to be 0. Above the diagonal, you take only the top right corner entry to be non-zero and everything else to be 0. Okay, so we have ones on the diagonal, we have 0 below, we have 0 above also, except perhaps for the top right corner, where you may take non-zero or 0 also. If you put everywhere 0 other than the diagonal entries and put 1 on the diagonal, that gives you the identity matrix, which should be there in every subgroup. So we will take this identity matrix and then we take all other elements with the property that these are upper triangular matrices with ones on the diagonal and only one possibly non-zero entry in the top right corner. You may later, after this lecture is complete, you may sit down and check for 3 by 3 matrices that this actually forms a subgroup which is isomorphic to R. The product, when you have ones on the diagonal and X there, multiplied to ones on the diagonal and Y there, will be the matrix of the same type, ones on the diagonal and X plus Y in that top right corner. So therefore, this is a subgroup which is isomorphic to R with the usual group structure, which is the addition. Now R is not compact and therefore GLNR is neither connected nor compact. The group SONR, on the other hand, is a connected group and it is also a compact group. So in mathematics, it is easy to prove that some property does not hold because you may take some consequence of the property being true and you can show that the consequence is not true, therefore the property will not hold, which is what we used in showing that G is not connected, because under determinant map it goes to a non-connected set. Therefore, G equal to GLNR is not compact. Similarly, it has closed subgroups which are not compact. So G equal to GLNR is not compact. Very lively audience. So if we now go to the group SONR, then this is in fact a connected and compact group. And let me just tell you, so we have connected but not compact. We have non-connected, non-compact. Here we have connected and compact. And let's just assume this, and I will give you an example of non-connected but compact. And that group is the group of all orthogonal matrices, whether you take the determinant to be 1 or -1. So that's a group which is not connected, but it is compact. It is not connected because again, the determinant map will take you from the orthogonal group to 1 and -1, which is not a connected set. So ONR is not connected, but it is compact because SONR is compact. So ONR is simply SONR union -1 into SONR, and therefore it's a compact set. So once we prove that SONR is compact, it will follow that ONR is also compact. Now, if we want to show that this group SONR is actually a connected and compact group, that will need a proof. So let's do one proof. We will prove this result, and I promise you that we will not prove any other result. We will stick to the exposition, but some result in a mathematics lecture needs to be proved. So this is going to be proved. We prove first of all that the group SONR is compact because this is an easier proof. So this is something which will be, very simple if you have done it once. Even if you have not done it once, you just imagine what I am telling you and then you can check out the calculations later. So the group G equal to SONR, or in fact this proof will also work for ONR. So don't worry about whether the determinant equal to 1 is used or not. This same proof will work for ONR also. So the matrix G in G, and whenever you are writing it to be matrix, we will fix some basis. So suppose we are writing it with respect to the standard basis, even into En. Okay. So we are writing this matrix and we have the property that G transpose is identity. Therefore, if you look at the row, each row in your group, in your matrix G, the transpose will transform the rows to columns and the product should give you identity. So that will tell you that any two rows, when you take the corresponding inner product, you are either going to get 0 or 1. Whenever the rows are distinct, you are going to get 0 because you will have ith row, which is the ith row in the matrix G, multiplied with the jth column in the transpose, which is really the jth row in the matrix. And you are going to take the dot product. So you are going to take x1 here, y1 here, plus x2, y2, plus x3, y3, dot, 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 xn, yn. And this will give you the ijth entry in the product, which has to be 0 if your product has to be an identity matrix. So two distinct rows are orthogonal. Moreover, any single row is of norm 1. That means when you take the ith row and take the inner product with the same ith row, which is taking the product in the matrix theory with the ith row of G and jth ith column of transpose, that should give you the ith entry, which is 1. So that will tell you that x1 square plus x2 square plus x3 square plus dot, dot, dot up to xn square is 1. So first of all, your matrix is given by some kind of polynomial equations, because if you write the matrix as given by xij, then for every fixed j, summation xij square as I varies should give you 1, and this is in fact enough for a matrix to be orthogonal. And therefore, and you further also have that the corresponding two distinct rows have to be orthogonal to each other. So that condition is also needed. So there are a bunch of polynomial equations which describe your group completely. So if you were to look at all these polynomial maps, put these maps on the set of n by n matrices, take their image, and then take the inverse image of a closed set, because the various inner products are going to give you 1 or 0. So you are putting the ones or 0 in the finitely many slots, which is a vector in some higher dimensional vector space, and then you are taking its inverse image of one single point. That gives you your group. So inverse image of a closed set is closed, inverse image of an open set is open under the continuous maps. Polynomial maps are continuous. So you get a closed subset first of all, and moreover, since your group is described by summation of the squares of entries in every fixed row is 1, that means there is a bound on each entry that you can have. In fact, the entries xi cannot be more than 1. If any xi is more than 1, you have that the square is bigger than 1. All the others are squares being positive, and then the sum cannot be 1. So there is a natural bound on the entries. So this set is a closed and bounded subset of the n square dimensional vector space over R, the space of n by n matrices with real entries. So closed and bounded subset of Euclidean space, and therefore it's a compact set. So the concept is very basic. To show something is compact in Euclidean, you have to prove it's closed and bounded. You should prove it's closed because it's an inverse image under a continuous map of a closed point. It is bounded because each row is orthonormal, and therefore there is a natural bound on each entry of the matrix. Therefore it's closed and bounded, and hence it is compact. Connectedness will require little more efforts. We need to prove a theorem before we go to connectedness. The connectedness works by some kind of induction. So what is the induction here? The induction says that suppose you have a connected closed subset, which is also a subgroup. So you have a connected closed subgroup H inside G, and then you take the coset space. I am not claiming that this H is normal. So this is not a group, but it's a set. And given any topological space and some equivalence relation which is obtained by taking the cosets with respect to capital H, we will be able to construct the corresponding quotient space. This G by H is the same quotient space. So we are assuming that H is connected. We are assuming that G by H is connected, and with these two we can prove that G is connected. And this proof is also not difficult once we understand all the intricacies of the various calculations. The basic idea is very simple. You assume that G is not connected, then you prove that G by H is not connected, which gives you a contradiction. This is the basic idea. But this basic idea needs to work. You have to work this out, and this is how we work it out. When we assume that our G is not connected, then you have what is called a disconnection of your group. So there are these two subsets which are non-empty, they are disjoint, and both are open. Okay, so both are also going to be closed because the complements are open, but let's not worry about them being closed right now. So you have G which is not connected, therefore you can split it off as a union of two subsets which are both open and non-empty. Moreover, the identity element in G has to be in one of the two, because A union B, it gives you G, so each element of G has to be in A or in B. If you assume that this one is in A, then the whole subgroup capital H has to be contained in A. That is because H is connected. If you did not have H to be contained in A, if there were some elements of H also going to B, Then you would intersect H with A and B. You would get a non-empty disjoint pair of open subsets of H, which will give you a contradiction for H being connected. So therefore, H has to be contained in capital A. All right. Moreover, whenever you have a connected subset and you multiply by any single group element, then we have observed that multiplication by a single group element gives you a smooth map. In particular, it's a continuous map. So because H is connected, the coset G1H that we have here, since H is connected, this coset G1H is also connected because it is image of H under the smooth map given by multiplication of G1. And whenever you have G1 contained in A, G1H being connected has to be in A because G1H is connected and G1H contains G1. Similarly, if you have G2 contained in B, then G2H has to be contained in capital B. The same reason will give you this. So whenever you take points in A and B, the corresponding cosets are contained completely in A and B. So A is a union of certain cosets and B is also a union of certain cosets. So when you take the projection map from G to G by H, A will go to those cosets whose union gives you A, B will go to those cosets whose union gives you B. And both these sets of cosets are non-empty because you started with A and B being non-empty. So there is a G1 in A and a G2 in B, and therefore there is a coset G1H contained in A and there is a coset G2H contained in B. So the images of these two sets A and B under these projection maps are also non-empty inside G by H. They are disjoint because you have disjoint sets to begin with and you apply a map to them, which will have to go to disjoint. You are defining a map on the whole image and this will go to disjoint subsets because you are precisely sending them to the corresponding cosets. You are, of course, you can take two disjoint sets and send them all to a single point. That will give you that images are not disjoint. But here you are looking at the cosets which give you the union, and there is no coset which is contained in both A and B, because that will give the contradiction to the cosets being connected. Same thing as we have proved that H being connected has to be contained in A once you have identity element in A. Similarly, for the coset, you will check for any single element in the coset, whether it's in A or B. And if it's in A, the whole coset goes and sits in A. Or if that element is in B, the whole coset will go and sit in B. The coset elements are like some of the best friends. So if you have one friend going in one particular class, all the other friends will go and sit in the same class. So therefore, the images will give you non-empty disjoint sets, and moreover, these are open because your projection map is an open map. This is one basic theory in topological spaces, that projection maps from G to the quotient space is an open map. And therefore, you are going to get two non-empty disjoint open subsets of G mod H, which is not possible because G mod H is connected. And so there must be something that we have assumed to, and that must be not correct. And that not correct thing is that G has to be now connected. So it's a very basic topological proof. You may ask where we have used the closeness of H. So in the proof, we have not used that H is closed. Everything will go through if you just assume H to be connected. But in the theory of topological groups, we always assume that our groups are Hausdorff spaces. And the spaces that we consider are also Hausdorff, and then that if you have to take G by H to be Hausdorff, then H has to be a closed subgroup. Because in a Hausdorff space, every single point is closed, and a point in G mod H being closed says that the coset in G has to be closed, and therefore H is taken to be closed. But the result still holds that you have a topological group, you take a close connected subgroup. If the quotient space is connected, then the whole G is connected. Don't forget, we are doing this to prove that SON R is a connected group. So we can now prove that G equal to SON R is connected. This is done in the following way. We are going to use the previous result. So we have to construct a subgroup H, and we have to consider the corresponding quotient space G mod H. What we observe is that the SON R is going to act on Rn. Whenever you take a vector in Rn and any matrix in SON R, V going to A into V, A times V will give you a group action. Okay. Rn is not a single orbit under the action of SON R. In fact, every set of points which is at a fixed distance from 0 will be preserved, because if you look at all vectors of distance 1 from 0, they will be preserved by the action of SONR, simply because our SONR preserves distances. And SONR being a set of matrices, it will send 0 to 0. Therefore, all vectors which are at distance 1 from 0 will be sent to themselves. So the set of vectors of norm 1 in Rn, which is called Sn minus 1. This is like S1 sitting in R2. The unit circle S1 sits in R2. S2, the unit sphere in R3. So you have typically the smaller n, the suffix here, the superscript is 1 less than this, because the dimension of the closed set is 1 less. Remember, I told you, when you have a manifold and you take a closed subset, the closed subset is a manifold again, but the dimension may change. And here it happens that the dimension drops down by 1. So that's the reason we use these particular symbols. But let's look at all vectors of norm 1 in Rn. That is called Sn minus 1. Now norm 1 means that each vector in this set has the property that x dot x is 1. So it is an orthonormal vector. And that will help us prove that our group G, which is SONR, is acting transitively on this. What does it mean to say that it acts transitively? I have two vectors, say x and y, in Sn minus 1. I should give you a matrix which will send x to y. Correct? Or what I will do is that I will prove that the standard unit vector E1 can be sent to any vector you want. So that will mean that every vector in Sn minus 1 is in the orbit of the vector E1. And then it's a single orbit, therefore you have the transitive action. So I will prove that there is a matrix which takes E1 to my vector x. That's all that I have to prove. So what I do is the following. I start with x. It's an orthonormal set, singleton. You can complete it to a basis of Rn. The basis that you get may not be orthonormal. Apply Gram-Schmidt method to make it an orthonormal basis. Since your x1, since your x was already orthonormal, it will not change. So you have x, comma v2, comma v3, comma dot 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 vn. This is an orthonormal basis for Rn. But every orthonormal basis, when you write it in terms of columns and get an n by n matrix, that's an orthonormal matrix. That's an orthogonal matrix, because you are getting that all the vectors are the basis is orthonormal. That means any two basis elements are orthogonal, and each matrix, each column has norm 1. So this is the matrix whose first column is x. Therefore, when you apply this matrix to E1, you are going to get your first column, which is X. And therefore, the group O and R acts transitively. We don't know whether the matrix that we constructed has determinant 1. That we still don't know. But if it doesn't have determinant 1, you can simply multiply the second entry by -1. So instead of X, V2, Vn, you can look at X minus V2, V3 dot 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 Vn. So that your matrix has now determinant 1 and you have successfully sent E1 to the vector X you started with. Therefore, G acts transitively on this set. And whenever you have a group acting transitively on the set, you choose any point and take the stabilizer. You then have that the G modulo stabilizer is equivalent to the orbit that you are working with. So here the stabilizer of our vector E1, once again, we look at only E1, is SO of the smaller rank. Because we are putting 1, 0, 0, 0. Now everything, all other columns have to be orthogonal with this. So when you take x1, x2, xn, in dot product with 1, 0, 0, 0, you are going to get x1. And that dot product has to be 0. So you are going to get all other columns whose first coordinates are 0. So your matrix, the stabilizer, will have 1 in the left top corner, 0 below, 0 on the right hand side, and then you get an n-1 by n-1 block, which also has to be orthogonal because the whole matrix has to be orthogonal. So the stabilizer is SOn-1. The quotient space is Sn-1, which is connected. It's the space of all norm 1 vectors, which is path connected. You can actually draw what is called a long circle, or this is equivalent to our great circle. This is called great circle. Whenever you have any two vectors in of norm 1, you consider the R2 generated by those two vectors. This R2 will intersect your ball in a circle, and that circle will give you a path from one vector to another vector while remaining inside the n-1 sphere Sn-1. So Sn-1 is connected by induction hypothesis starting from SO2. We have that SOn-1 is connected, and then SOn is connected by using the previous result. So SOn upon SOn-1 is connected, being the n-1 sphere. SOn-1 is connected by induction hypothesis, and the induction starts from SO2 because SO2 is nothing but S1, which is connected. So induction will tell you that SOn has to be connected. So what we did in all these two proofs is that we studied one particular Lie group, and we proved two very basic topological properties of the group SO2, SON-R. So this is one very specific type of Lie groups that we studied, but the proofs were not easy. The proofs are not very deep, but they were not easy. So this is something that we should keep in mind. And the next thing that we should go for are the classification, but perhaps this proof lecture will go for say 30 more minutes. So if there are any questions, I could perhaps look at those questions. Good morning, everybody. Can't see the slides, but perhaps it came back. There is no question that is asked, so maybe you can put your questions and I will take Gautam Borisagar. Hi Gautam. So Gautam says that finite group of Lie type.
Hi.
I don't know if I'll be able to say something about finite group of Lie type right now, but yeah, I'll come to that at the end of the lecture. Thanks for attending and thanks for this suggestion.
Okay.
Are all Lie groups matrix groups? That is not true, Jisha. So there are non-matrix groups. Maybe that is also something that I will come to. But let me now go to the classification. So why do we classify? So classification is something which is very important and very useful. Classification is there not just in mathematics, but in all. I would say classification is there throughout our life. The periodic table that we study in school, that is some kind of classification. In fact, this classification theory began very early. In our ancient philosophies, there is some philosophy called Sankhya, which was originated by the Rishi called Kanad. And this Sankhya is basically this philosophy which says that whenever you want to study some particular types of objects, you should try to classify them and study them. That is the philosophy in nutshell. So this is something which is very, very ancient in India, and it's also very practical. I am sure you all must be helping your spouses in household work now that the quarantine is there. Everybody is at home, and so we are all helping as much as we can. And there is this nice word for that called the quarantine workout. But what it really means is that you do jhadu pocha and you do bartans. So while doing bartans, classification is something which is very useful. If you classify all the vessels as per the sizes, suppose you clean the big ones first and arrange them properly in the basket, and then do the smaller ones and then put them on top of the basket, so that if you put the smaller ones first and the bigger ones later, then the smaller ones will not be able to dry quickly. So putting bigger ones below and the smaller ones on top of that will help you. Then you may do plates which you can put on the sides, and in the end you may do spoons which you can just put on the corners, so that they can also be easily taken. You don't have to go through all the vessels to find one spoon. So classification is very useful. I think if this one thing that you take from this lecture and go help your spouse and clean the vessels by using this classification, that will be something that will be nice outcome of this lecture. So classification of Lie groups. What do we mean by classification? So classification should tell you these two things. Given any pair of Lie groups, it should tell you whether G1 is not isomorphic to G2. So how would we do this? We will say that G1 is what? So again, classification doesn't mean that, once you have a pair of groups, you will start to check whether they are isomorphic. You try to define various maps from one Lie group to another, and then finally perhaps conclude after some efforts that there is no such map. That's not what we mean here. Classification would mean that you fix a set of Lie groups, and then we associate a finite data to each element on this set. And therefore, given any two such Lie groups, G1 and G2, we will quickly look at the data, and from the data, we will be able to tell whether they are isomorphic or not. So again, saying that whether they are isomorphic or not is a bit vague. What we are often able to tell is when they are not isomorphic. So there will be some things associated to the Lie groups. For instance, if you were looking at the group of orthogonal matrices and the group Rn, then these two cannot be isomorphic because one is compact, another is not compact. Or you may say Rn is connected, orthogonal group is not connected. So there are these topological properties which will quickly tell you when they are not isomorphic. But we should also be able to tell when a given pair is isomorphic. That is also important. Otherwise, if we are just able to distinguish, what may happen is that you have two groups, and the properties that you are looking for might turn out to be the same, and yet you will not know whether they are isomorphic or not. They may not be isomorphic always, by the way, because there might be yet another property which we have not discovered, which is not same for the pair of groups G1, G2. So it is important to also know. So this will, if you are able to tell when G1 is isomorphic to G2, it will be a complete classification. That is what we are looking for. So here is one, caution that I would like to make, that classifying Lie groups in general is almost an impossible task. You should not hope for this, and the reason for that is that every finite group is a Lie group. Every finite group is a subgroup of a symmetric group, Sn, and you can put Sn inside GLNR. You can consider all the n by n matrices whose entries are 1 and 0, and every row and every column has only one 1. All other are 0. These are what are called permutation matrices. If you take a set of n vectors and apply, so anyway, let me not tell why these are called permutation matrices. If you take your matrix and take conjugation by these permutation matrices, then your rows and columns get permuted. So that is why they are called permutation matrices. But every symmetric group, finite symmetric group, is contained in a Lie group, and being a finite subset, it's also a closed subgroup. Therefore, every finite symmetric group is a Lie group, and then every finite group is a Lie group. But we don't know finite groups. In the last century, the whole last century was used in classifying finite simple groups. So going to finite groups is a task which is even difficult to climb, more difficult to climb than the Mount Everest. But the finite simple groups, those were also very difficult. The whole century of very connected efforts of huge number of mathematicians went into this, and there are still some doubts. We don't even know that the classification of finite simple groups is complete. We hope that it is complete, but whether the proof is complete, that we don't know. So therefore, we have to put some restrictions on the Lie groups that we are going to classify. So we are going to deal with this finite group thing in one word, and we will say that we are going to assume that our Lie groups are connected. So we will start with the assumption that Lie groups that we consider here are connected Lie groups. Now, there could have been one more small cute result that perhaps I should have at least mentioned, not necessarily have proved, which is that you take your Lie group, and you take, Lie group is also a topological space. So you may take the connected components, and among the connected components, you may take that one which contains identity element. That connected component containing the identity element turns out to be a closed normal subgroup of the Lie group. And therefore, once you go modulo this normal subgroup, you get a quotient group which is discrete. So, it may seem that we are assuming too much when we say that our Lie group is connected, but in some sense we are not assuming too much, because either your group is connected, or if it is not connected, then your connected component containing identity element is a normal closed subgroup, and the quotient is a discrete group, which we are not really going to consider right now. Okay, so there is a way to go back from the connected component to the Lie group by means of some exact sequence, but we are not going to do that right now. Okay. So once again, what we are going to do is to distinguish the Lie groups based on various properties. And these properties can be classified into 3 types, roughly. The first one is what are called algebraic properties. So you may assume that your Lie groups are abelian. If you have one Lie group to be abelian, another non-abelian, then they are not going to be isomorphic. So you may assume that both are abelian. And then you can ask whether they can be classified. You can look for connected Lie groups, simply connected Lie groups. So this is where some algebraic topology comes in. Or you may ask for compact Lie groups. And finally, differential properties, which is the dimension of the manifold, for instance. If you have 2 Lie groups, one is 1-dimensional, another is of 10 dimensions, then there is no way that these can be isomorphic. So I did not explain what is an isomorphism of Lie groups, but it has to be a smooth map whose inverse is smooth, such that both are group homomorphisms. This is what we are asking for when we talk about isomorphism of Lie groups. So all these properties, the algebraic properties, topological properties, and the differential properties, they have to be preserved under the isomorphism. So you may restrict yourself to some of these and then you get nice results. So for instance, this is one very nice result. Every abelian connected Lie group is isomorphic to S1 cross S1 cross S1, a finitely many types, times cross RL. So we have seen S1, which is our group SO2. That's an abelian group. We have seen RL, which is Rn. You replace N by L. So these are all abelian connected groups. Their product is abelian connected, and moreover, every abelian connected Lie group is isomorphic to this. I have not given the proof, but to prove this, what we need to use are the corresponding Lie algebras. So Lie algebra to a Lie group is the tangent space at the identity element for the topological space or the manifold, which has a natural structure of a Lie algebra. So there is an algebra, it's a vector space together with some kind of a product, which is called Lie product. And then the Lie algebras are vector spaces, so they are somewhat easier objects than groups to understand. And if your group is connected, then the Lie algebra almost always will determine your Lie group. And abelian Lie group will mean that the corresponding Lie algebra is abelian, which means that the products are zero. So that Lie algebra is simply a copy of R. It's a Euclidean space. And therefore here, the corresponding Lie group can be either S1 or R. And so you have that it's the product of S1s and Rs. So if you put some more conditions, suppose you are looking for an abelian connected Lie group of dimension 1. Then you will take such product and you will check when the dimension can be 1. It can be 1 when you have a single S1 or when you have a single R, and no other possibility will be there. So every abelian connected Lie group of dimension 1 has to be S1 or R. You may ask about, so this is a typo. I should not have said R cross. I should have said positive reals. If you look at positive reals, that's a Lie group because it's an open subset of R. It's also a group, and the product is smooth, inverse is smooth. So positive reals is a Lie group of dimension 1. Here we say that a Lie group of dimension 1, which is abelian and connected, is S1 or R. So indeed, the positive reals are isomorphic to R. If you were to look at dimension 2 coming from here, you will see that it can be S1 cross S1, S1 cross R, or R cross R. So you will have that it is S1 cross S1, R2, and S1 cross R. These are the only three possible abelian connected Lie groups of dimension 2. And now if you look at C cross, the non-zero complex numbers, that's an open subset in R2. So therefore it's a manifold. It is also a group, and you can check that the corresponding maps are continuous, smooth in fact. So C cross, this is a connected abelian Lie group of dimension 2 being an open subset in R2. And so it has to be isomorphic to one of these, and the polar decomposition will tell you that it is isomorphic to S1 cross positive reals, but positive reals is same as reals. This positive reals is same as reals. This can be seen by the exponential and logarithmic map. So the isomorphism from positive reals to reals is the logarithm. The inverse of that is the exponential map. That's a group homomorphism, something that you should check. So this is one very nice result, and the proof is somewhat deep, and it uses the theory of Lie algebras. We can put some more conditions after abelian and connected. Suppose I say that I will look at only compact Lie groups which is abelian and connected. Then you will not have the copies of R, because now the group is compact. So every such group will have to be a finite product of S1. There is no other possibility. So these are what are called tori. S1 cross S1 is our standard torus. And then if you take S1 cross S1 cross S1, that's called a 3 torus, 4 torus, and then you have an n torus in general. These are the only abelian connected compact Lie groups. If you were to say instead that you will look at simply connected Lie group, then the copies of S1 cannot come, because the fundamental group of product of topological spaces is the product of fundamental groups. Therefore, S1s cannot come, so you will only get RL. Every abelian connected, simply connected Lie group has to be isomorphic to the L-dimensional vector space RL. So if you again, in both these results, if you put dimension also, then you have a complete classification. All right, so this was when we had abelianness and solvable and nilpotent. These are in some sense obtained from abelian groups by means of exact sequences. So this is obtained only in theory. Doing it in practice is very difficult. There are some nice results. For instance, every solvable Lie group. Somebody asked whether every Lie group is a matrix group. The answer to that is no, and I will give an example later. But every solvable Lie group is a matrix group. In fact, every solvable Lie group can be put inside upper triangular matrices with non-zero entries on the diagonal. So you have the upper triangular matrix subgroup of the GLN, the n by n matrices, and every solvable Lie group can be put inside this. Every nilpotent group being solvable can be put inside this, but nilpotent will also have the property that you have ones on the diagonal. So these are some of the nice structure results for solvable and nilpotent groups, but if you want to classify them, then it's a very messy thing. Classifying all subgroups of upper triangular 4x4 matrices is not an easy task. So it can be done in theory, but it's not easy. Okay, so when we were looking at classification, we mentioned some properties here, and abelian, solvable, nilpotent, these have been dealt with. These are the two properties which we have not yet even defined. So let me now go and define them. This is something that you should keep in mind, that these properties, semi-simple and simple, these are on the other extreme if you consider the abelian groups. So solvable groups, nilpotent groups, and abelian groups, these are obtained because they have some nice properties. So, you know, solvable group is obtained as an exact sequence of abelian groups. Nilpotent groups can also be obtained. You have central extensions of abelian groups. So these are the groups which have lots and lots of normal subgroups. And we are going to the other extreme. So semi-simple Lie group is a connected Lie group. I had said that we are going to assume connectedness from now on. So I am going to put connected only in bracket. So a semi-simple Lie group is a connected Lie group. We will also assume that it is non-abelian, because you have the example of S1 perhaps, which will give you such a counter example if you do not assume non-abelian. But non-abelian is a technical condition that we have to take. So non-abelian Lie group which has no non-trivial, normal, connected abelian subgroup. So semi-simple means you have no non-trivial, normal, connected abelian subgroup. You are allowed to have abelian subgroups which are not normal, which are connected. That is okay. You are allowed to have normal subgroups which are not connected. So normal abelian subgroups are also possible, and I am giving an example here. The group SL2R, that's a simple group, in fact, and therefore it is semi-simple. It has center of order 2. So you have a normal abelian subgroup, but an order 2 subgroup is not connected. Okay, and moreover you have this, the connected cover of the simply connected cover of SL2R. So there is a very nice decomposition of SL2R as SO2 cross upper triangular matrices of some special type, and as a topological space also. Therefore, if you wanted to compute the fundamental group of SL2, you will have the fundamental group of SO2 cross the fundamental group of this special group of matrices, which has trivial fundamental group. So fundamental group of SL2 is the fundamental group of SO2, which is Z, infinite discrete group, infinite cyclic group. And therefore, the simply connected cover of SL2, which is also a Lie group, because the simply connected cover will be evenly covered by our open subset in SL2. Therefore, that's also a manifold. You can actually prove that it's a Lie group also. The products are smooth, the inverse map is smooth, and so on. So this is a cover which is known to be a non-linear group. So this is an example to the question that somebody had asked. Here we have a Lie group which is not a matrix group. If you were to look at only matrix groups, then the classification can be slightly made simple. But in general, a Lie group need not be a matrix group. Okay, so semi-simple Lie group are the one which have no non-trivial connected abelian subgroups, and simple Lie group is one which has no non-trivial connected subgroup. Forget about abelian, not even a subgroup. Okay, so simple Lie group is the one which has no non-trivial connected normal subgroup. And once you put these very restrictive, these very strict restrictions, then you would hope that there is a nice answer to the classification. There is a nice answer, and I will perhaps go a bit fast here. Already close to 12:30. So the classification program now proceeds as follows. You have that every semi-simple Lie group is almost a direct product of simple Lie groups. So what it means is that there is a central extension of direct product of simple Lie group. You take a finite bunch of Lie groups which are simple, take their direct products. Those will be semi-simple because each of them have no non-trivial connected subgroup and they are non-abelian. Therefore, the corresponding product will have no non-trivial normal connected abelian subgroup. So it is a semi-simple Lie group. Just as we have proved that SL2 tilde, a central extension of SL2R, is a Lie group. Similarly, a central extension of direct product of simple Lie groups, that's also a Lie group. And by the definition of semi-simple Lie group, it will turn out that it is a semi-simple Lie group. And the classification will tell you that every semi-simple Lie group has to be of this type. Okay, so you have semi-simple Lie group which is almost a direct product of simple Lie groups. So we will classify simple Lie groups. They are classified up to center, because again the example of SL2 will tell you that SL2 and SL2 tilde, the change is only in the center. There is no change in a local scale, and the Lie algebra, which is going to look at only the local information, will not be able to detect between SL2 and SL2 tilde. So we will assume that our groups have no center and then classify them. This is done by considering the associated Lie algebra script G to our simple Lie group capital G. This will turn out to be a simple Lie algebra. There is a root system associated to that, which is a finite combinatorial object. Then one associates a Dynkin diagram to the root system. Dynkin diagram is a connected graph without loops, and these Dynkin diagrams can be classified. These are all possible Dynkin diagrams. So here we have AN, which corresponds to the groups SLN plus 1. BN correspond to SO2N plus 1. CN corresponds to what is called the symplectic groups. DN correspond to SO2N. BN, B for Bombay or B for Bengaluru, that corresponds to the odd SOs, SO2N plus 1. And DN, D for Delhi, corresponds to the even orthogonal groups. And then there are these 5 exotic groups called G2, F4, and E6, E7, E8. So these are some of the very nice simple Lie groups, and all simple Lie groups up to a center are isomorphic to one of these. So this will tell you that whenever there are two Lie groups which are simple and have no center, if their Dynkin diagrams are same, then they are same. For instance, if you were to look at B1 and A1, so A1 is SL2, B1 is SO3, okay, and you go modulo center because you are assuming that your simple Lie groups have no center, then you get that the corresponding Lie groups are isomorphic. So these Dynkin diagrams will classify the connected simple adjoint, and you may have to assume compact, or you may say that I will not assume compact. So one of these two will classify these groups faithfully. So you have that SA1, which is the, if you assume compact, then it is SU2. If you assume not compact, then it is SL2. So SL2 is isomorphic to SO3, of course modulo center, which is isomorphic to the first symplectic group. There is next isomorphism, which is B2 isomorphic to C2. So if you have B2 and C2, that means you have two vertices, and it seems that there are multiple edges with different arrows. But if you have only two vertices, then you may just flip the diagram and you will get the diagram for C2. And indeed, the corresponding groups, so B2 is SO5 and C2 is SP4. These groups modulo center are isomorphic. Next is D2 isomorphic to A1 cross A1. So DNs will start from D2 because the diagram should have one vertex here, and in the end there are two vertices. So you start from D2, which has only two disconnected vertices. Then D3 will give you this, only these three. Then D4 will give you these two, and then there will be one here. D5 will give you one more, D6 will give you one more, and so on. So if you look at D2, then you are going to get only two disjoint vertices, and a single vertex corresponds to A1 or to B1 or to C1. And two disjoint vertices should give you the product of those simple groups. And indeed, that is what happens. Modulo center, D2 is isomorphic to A1 cross A1. And there is a small typo here also, that D3 is isomorphic to A3. D3 gives you only these three, and A3 is these three. So since the corresponding graphs are the same, we will have that the corresponding Lie groups modulo center are also isomorphic. So this is what that I would want to do. There are things that we have missed. We have not touched upon these two very important things. We have not touched upon the history of Lie groups. I told you very briefly that the Lie groups originated when we were looking at the differential equations and solutions to them. So typically what happens is that differential equations, we are looking at linear differential equations. So their solutions will form one parameter subgroups. And then we look at the groups generated by these one parameter subgroups. One parameter subgroups look like the subgroup which we had isomorphic to R in the very beginning inside GLN. So it will be upper triangular with ones on the diagonal, and any fixed slot you will have either positive 0 or non-zero entry, but all other entries are to be taken to be 0. These are how the one parameter subgroups look like. So there will be some possible images. So what you really have is that there is a map from R to GLNR, and you take the image of, there is an isomorphic copy of R sitting inside GLNR, and by the theory of solvable Lie groups, we know that every such thing can be put inside upper triangular matrices. So you have one particular subgroup in the upper triangular matrix. These are the one parameter subgroups, and the groups generated by them were studied by Sophus Lie in the very beginning, and that is what has developed into this beautiful theory of Lie groups named after this mathematician Sophus Lie. Since I did not talk about history, I did not also mention this name until now. Another thing is about representations of Lie groups. So I saw that you have had a lecture in this seminar before doing representation theory, perhaps of finite groups. And there is a similar theory for Lie groups representations. If you take compact groups, then all irreducible representations can be explained nicely. If your groups are non-compact, there is a very beautiful theory due to Harishchandra, a mathematician, one of the greatest mathematicians from India, second only after Ramanujan, I would say, who has worked single-handedly in this theory of representations of Lie groups. So these are two beautiful theories that we have not touched upon, but I'm, meaning with limited time, I could not have done more. So Gautam has asked about finite groups of Lie type. The groups that we have studied here in the classification that I told you just now, SLN, SO2N plus 1 and SO2N, and CN being symplectic group, and then these finite groups. So all these groups can be expressed by means of some polynomial equations. For instance, SLN is given by the polynomial determinant equal to 1. The Bn and Dn, the orthogonal groups, we have already seen that they are given by some sort of polynomial equations. Similarly, Cn are these symplectic groups, which are the groups which preserve the alternating forms, non-degenerate alternating forms. And so those are also given by different set of polynomial equations. And then these remaining groups can also be written down using some polynomials. But when you have a set of polynomials, you would wonder, where are the coefficients of polynomials coming from? So interestingly, all these polynomials are defined over Z, because determinant has coefficients equal to 1 or minus 1. There is no other coefficient in the determinant polynomial. Similarly, when you took B and Dn, you were only taking the dot products of the vectors, and then the equality was with 1 or 0. So again, 1 and 0 were involved, and similarly for Cn, you had 1, minus 1 or 0. You will have only these. It happens that for these 5 also, there is a similar thing, that you will need only the integers to define these polynomials. So you may consider the corresponding sets inside matrices over finite fields as well. And these are what are loosely called finite groups of Lie type. So there is the theory of SLN over a finite field FQ. There are these other groups, SO2N FQ, SO2N plus FQ, SO2N plus 1 FQ, symplectic groups over FQ. You need to worry about what are the polynomials which will give G2, F4, E6, E7, E8. There is also another beautiful way to describe these groups, which was developed by a French mathematician by name Claude Chevalet. And so these are now called Chevalet groups. So the finite groups of Lie type are very useful. In fact, I mentioned the finite simple Lie groups and their classification. And finite groups of Lie type give a big chunk of examples in the examples of finite simple groups. So this is all that I have about finite groups of Lie type also. And with this, I would like to stop here. Thank you very much for your patience, and thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you, sir. There are some questions in the chat box.
Great.
New questions. Will you go through that?
Okay. So I think I had come up to here. So Gautam had say something about finite group of Lie type. I said something. Maybe with Gautam I can discuss later also. Are all Lie groups matrix groups? So I give you an example saying that this is not a matrix group. Please explain smooth manifold again. Smooth manifold is a manifold. So manifold, has this, that every point has a neighborhood. Maybe I should stop presenting so that I will see everybody clearly. So manifold means that you have a neighborhood around each point, which is homeomorphic to some open subset in Rn, or let's say an open ball in Rn. Okay, and this homeomorphism seems to depend on the point and on the open subset that you have started with. Now it can happen that you have two open subsets containing your point, and they might be homeomorphic to some two completely different open balls inside Rn. And then what happens is that for the intersection, you will have images under these two open balls. Okay. So you have a composition map coming in the other direction from Rn to your set and then going again to Rn is a composition which gives you a map from some subset of the open ball to another subset of the open ball. And when you have maps from Rn to Rn, you can talk about differentiability, infinite differentiability of these maps. So we demand that our manifolds have the property that all these maps, which are perhaps called structure maps, that these maps be smooth. This is what we ask. Very briefly, I think this is the definition of a smooth manifold. Can you mention some algebraic results of a Lie group G which can be proved using topological properties of G? So, okay, so I will mention the theory that representation theory can be understood using the topology of G. If your G happens to be a compact group, then it can be proved that every representation of group G, every finite dimensional representation is completely reducible. So this is one wonderful example of using topology of G to prove something which is about algebra, that your group is acting on a vector space, and what we are proving is that the vector space can be decomposed into two subspaces whose direct sum is your vector space, and moreover each of the subspaces are invariant under the group. So you can decompose every representation as a direct sum of irreducible representations if your group happens to be compact. Generally, can you explain how these are interrelated? So I have already given an example how algebraic properties can be proved using topological results. And I also told you the hairy-ball theorem, which tells that topological results are also obtained using algebraic properties. There are also some nice things about Lie groups. I think, I will have to check this, but every compact Lie group, which is simple, has other than SL2, has finite top fundamental group. So this is, I think, what is known anyway is that every compact simple Lie group has a fundamental group which is finitely generated, and if you are taking it to be of rank more than 1, then the fundamental groups are finite. So this is one way how you can derive a topological property of the group, knowing something about the algebraic structure. The more you know about some set will help you in getting more and more properties of the set. Now, what are called algebraic, what are called topological is something that is up to us. So basically, the thing that we should keep in mind is that the more and more you know about some set, the more useful it will be to help getting structure. Prakash Upadhyay wants to know, can you explain the Lie group of transformation and its generators? What transformation are you asking, Prakash? If you are here and if you can maybe talk for a minute. I did not really understand. So transformation groups, generators, there may not be a finite set of generators all the time. For instance, GLNR or SLNR, they are known to have non-finite generators. Even if you take R doesn't have a finite set of generators if you are looking at group theory generators. Sir, could you please mention how cross product can be generalized in higher dimensions using Lie algebra? No, that cannot be generalized. Cross product cannot be generalized because what you want, cross product is a map from R3 to R3, R3 cross R3 to R3 of a very specific type. And there is no cross product in general, but there is something called as a Lie product, but Lie product is not cross product. It just happens that cross product agrees with Lie product on a very specific three-dimensional Lie algebra, the algebra of what are called quaternions, pure quaternions. But other than that, other than this coincidence, I don't think that there is any way to see cross product in general using Lie algebra. I will have to search for that. Alans Kurian wanted to ask, sir, you mentioned that every finite group is Lie group. Can we say that finite simple groups are Lie groups? Then sporadic groups also Lie group? How can we say that finite groups are Lie group? Good question. All the questions are good, but this question is good because it tells me that I have missed one point. I did say that, but I perhaps did not emphasize it properly, which is that whenever you want to see some group as a Lie group, you should see the topology on that. So the groups that we are looking at, the finite groups, these are coming with the discrete topology. And when you have the discrete topology, then every group is a Lie group. In discrete topology, every group is a Lie group. So there should be nothing surprising on having finite groups as Lie groups. But I gave you an example to see how you can see finite group as a Lie group in a natural way. You put finite group inside symmetric groups, which can then be put inside GLNR. So that's a natural way to see that the every finite group is a Lie group. Now, when you look at finite simple groups, those are coming in a different way. Those are also Lie groups, clearly, because every finite group is a Lie group. But the theory of Lie groups over Euclidean spaces is not going to help you classify and understand these finite simple groups. It will not deal with finite groups. Once again, there is a question about from Divya Jyoti. Please explain Lie group of transformations. Again, please tell me what we mean by transformations. And then there is a feedback link. Sudipta Mukhopadhyay wants to know whether I will share my PPT. So how do I share? You may perhaps search for me in Google. Send me an email and I'll be happy to send the PPTs to you. I will have to make those two corrections. So I will be happy to share the PPT. I can also, of course, share the PPT with Matthew sir, who has already. Yes,
Sir,
Sudipta.
please share your mail ID then, sir.
Okay, I will write my email ID. I thought, meaning I thought I am famous enough that I can be searched on Google and people will know my email ID, but I will give it. I have given it in the
Yes,
chat.
sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Lie, sure, of course. Chaupat Raja wants to know Lie group related polynomial equation. So I did not understand this question. Cyril Jacob wants to know, can you once again give the vector field argument used to say that S2 can't have a Lie group structure? No, I cannot do this because we are not proving that S2 cannot have a Lie group structure using the hairy-ball theorem. Where the way to prove that is that you prove independently that S2 cannot be a Lie group. And that can be done once you accept the classification of simple compact Lie groups. So once you know what are connected compact Lie groups, which are obtained by knowing the abelian and simple Lie groups, then you will be able to see that S2 cannot be a Lie group with the ambient topology on that. And therefore, as a result, by using a theorem which is proved by Milnor, I think Milnor got Fields Medal for proving this result. So using Milnor's result, we will have that S2 cannot have a non-vanishing everywhere continuous vector field. And because your S2 is compact, you can perhaps normalize this vector field. And so you cannot have a vector field of where vectors are all of norm 1 and it's a continuous vector field on S2. Sorry, Cyril?
Do you mean the vector field is a tangent vector field, right?
No. Yeah, tangent vector field. Yes,
yeah.
Tangent vector field. Yeah.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah, thank you. People are saying thank you. One or two current problems in Lie groups. Ali Akbar, CU Kerala wants to know. There are many questions that can be asked. Whenever if I'm asked to mention problems in Lie groups, I will mention the problems which are of my interest. So, given any group, one would want to know how are its conjugacy classes given, how are its Z classes given. What is a Z class? Z class is basically you are putting two elements in the same Z class if their centralizers are conjugate in the group. So I think the description of all Z classes in given Lie groups are not yet known. So this would be a very, very nice problem. Describe Z classes in simple Lie groups. This is one very nice question. So maybe I should just add that here in the chat box. Okay. People are thanking. Thank you for your kind reactions, kind comments. What could be, so Prafulla Kumar Kaushik, hi Prafulla, nice to see you. He is asking what could be a reason to treat dimension as differential geometric property instead of topological. Can you say something more about this? It was nice talk as always. Thank you, Prafulla. So dimension as differential geometric because we are looking at it as an n-dimensional manifold. That's the reason that we are calling it differential geometric. I just wanted to specify it as different from the topological properties, connectedness, compactness. These are properties, whereas the dimension will associate some invariant. So I wanted to, put it in a different way. That's the only reason.
Okay.
Every Lie group is represented by polynomial.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a question whether every Lie group is represented by polynomial. I will have to think about this, whether every Lie group can be given in terms of polynomials. What we know is that, so this is asked by Kamayani Shukla. I don't know the answer to that right now. Whether every Lie group can be given as, what you perhaps mean is that given a Lie group, is there some set of polynomials such that your Lie group is the zero set of those polynomials? So, there is a concept, I should have known this. So there is a concept called an algebraic group. And what you're asking for is precisely this, something which is an algebraic group. And it is known that every Lie group is not an algebraic group. The example of SL2 tilde is an example of a Lie group which is not an algebraic group. And therefore, Kamayani, every Lie group need not be given by polynomials. Are there open problems? There are always open problems in any theory that you are looking at. Langland's problem gives you one very big set of open problems connected to Lie groups. You would want to understand how are representations of Lie groups done. And so that seems to be all. Cyril wants to know how to give manifold structure for space with discrete topology. So why not? Meaning your open sets are just singletons and they are isomorphic to, they are the zero dimensional manifolds. All right, so that seems to be all. So Matthew sir, it is back to you.
Sir, one last question is there. Now it appeared.
It seems more like a, it seems more like a suggestion. We can directly, Harshit has given this, we can directly map each point to some open ball of Rn. Not really Rn, it's the zero dimensional. So, just to make the definition of Lie group all inclusive, we will also take a single point to be the zero dimensional vector space. Just the zero. That's R0 for us. And then every discrete group will be a Lie group.
Okay, then we will wind up the session for this. It was a very informative and motivating session by Dr. Sripath M. Garge. So I will call upon Professor Tibin Thomas to wind up the sessions.
Thank you, sir. It is now my pleasant duty to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of Department of Mathematics, SB College, and myself. I express our sincere gratitude to Dr. Sripath M. Garge for the very informative and wonderful talk on Lie groups and sparing his valuable time to be with us. Thank you very much, sir. Next, I should like to thank Dr. Shine C. Matthew and all my colleagues for the enthusiasm and encouragement for conducting this type of webinar. Last but not the least, I thank all the participants for their interest in this program. Thanks again all for making the webinar a great success. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Once again, I thank Dr. Sripath Garge and all the participants and the coordinator, Professor Tibin Thomas, and Ms. Ginu Mary Jameson and all the faculty members who helped a lot in the conduct of this program. So thank you once again. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.